There is a power in a woman that is often misunderstood, not in how loud she speaks, not in how much attention she demands, but in how silently she walks away when she feels her worth has been dismissed. You see, ego is not just a masculine concept. A woman, too, holds an ego not of domination, but of deep self-worth, intuition, and emotional integrity. When you hurt a woman's ego, it doesn't erupt, it withdraws. It doesn't seek revenge, it redefines boundaries, and the moment she starts choosing peace over proving herself, that's when he starts to notice, because men don't become obsessed with women who chase. They become obsessed with women who elevate, women who stop shrinking themselves for love, who walk with grace, but also with non-negotiable standards. The secret is this: don't fight for someone to value you. Show them what it's like to lose access to you. You don't make him obsessed by looking perfect. You make him obsessed by becoming unreachable to his old patterns. When you stop overgiving, over-explaining, over-fixing, you shift the dynamic entirely. A woman's ego, when healthy, becomes her silent armor. It doesn't scream, "Look at me." It whispers, "You had your chance." And that whisper is louder than any scream, because a woman who has learned to regulate her energy, who has learned to give love without losing herself, who doesn't react but responds, she becomes a mystery, a challenge not of games, but of growth. He doesn't become obsessed with your body, your beauty, or your charm. He becomes obsessed with your absence of need, your emotional discipline, your refusal to beg, your power to choose solitude over chaos. She becomes the mirror he cannot escape, because you reflect not who he is, but who he must become to be worthy of you again. When we speak of ego, we often think of arrogance, pride, or the need to dominate. But for a woman, ego takes a very different form. It isn't about being better than others. It's about remembering her worth in a world that constantly asks her to forget it. A woman's ego is tied deeply to her self-respect, her intuition, and her boundaries. It's not loud, but it's firm. It doesn't need to prove, it simply knows. From a young age, many women are taught to shrink to be polite, agreeable, self-sacrificing. She's told that being good means being silent, being small, being less of a burden. But buried beneath all of that conditioning lies a quiet force, her ego. This ego isn't toxic. In fact, it's sacred. It's the inner voice that says, "You deserve more than breadcrumbs. You're not here to fix broken men. You don't need to prove your love by tolerating disrespect. Your softness is a strength, but it is not permission for anyone to walk over you." When that ego is hurt, when her worth is questioned, dismissed, or minimized, it doesn't explode in rage. It retreats with elegance. She starts pulling back, not to punish, but to protect. She doesn't scream, she disconnects. And this is where the obsession begins, because the moment she shifts her focus inward, the moment she stops pouring into someone who doesn't pour back, the moment she chooses herself, the world begins to see her differently. She doesn't need validation from the outside. She becomes her own validation. And when that happens, a man who once took her for granted suddenly feels her absence like a weight on his soul. Why? Because a woman in her worth, who stands quietly in the power of her ego, no longer needs him. And that is when he starts to need her. Most people misunderstand the emotional nature of a woman. They think if you hurt her, she'll cry, shout, argue, or break down. They expect emotional outbursts, tears, drama, confrontation. But that's not how a woman with self-awareness responds. Not a woman who knows her value. When you hurt her ego, when you dismiss her, betray her trust, belittle her dreams, or ignore her emotional needs, she doesn't explode. She disappears. It's not an act of revenge. It's an act of preservation. Her silence isn't passive. It's powerful. It doesn't mean she doesn't feel the pain. It means she refuses to let the pain reduce her. This is where many men make the mistake. They assume she didn't argue, so she must be fine. They think she didn't react, so it didn't hurt her. But what they don't see is what happens internally. Inside, she's detaching. Emotionally, she's shifting. Mentally, she's rewriting the story. She begins to see you not as her partner, but as a lesson. She starts to remember who she was before she compromised so much for love. And the more she remembers her power, the further she drifts from your reach. You see, distance is not always measured in miles. Sometimes the greatest distance is when two people sit in the same room, but one of them has already left in spirit. She stops checking in, stops explaining herself, stops trying to make you see her value, not because she stopped loving you, but because she started loving herself more. This emotional withdrawal isn't a punishment. It's a natural response to being consistently unheard, unseen, or unappreciated. And once she's gone in that way, once her heart no longer beats for the connection you once shared, even 1,000 apologies may not bring her back to the version of her you once had access to. There is a kind of silence that isn't empty, it's full of meaning, a kind of quiet that echoes louder than any spoken word. This is the silence a woman gives when she's finally done explaining her worth. At first, she may try to communicate. She'll speak gently, maybe even cry. She'll open her heart, hoping you'll meet her there. She'll explain how she feels, what hurts her, what she needs from you, not because she's weak, but because she believes the bond is worth fighting for. But if she's unheard long enough, if her voice is met with resistance, mockery, or indifference, something shifts. She stops talking, not because she has nothing to say, but because she realizes speaking to someone who refuses to listen only drains her soul. You see, when a man gets angry, he may shout. When a woman gets hurt, she may grow quiet, and in that silence lives the greatest transformation, because her silence doesn't mean she has nothing left to express. It means she's done trying to convince you. She's done breaking herself down just to be understood. She's done pleading for presence from someone who only shows up when it's convenient. That silence isn't the absence of emotion. It's the culmination of too much emotion that has gone unacknowledged for too long. In that stillness, she begins to observe. She watches the way you respond to her detachment. She notices what you do with her absence. She evaluates whether you chase or simply carry on without her like she was never needed, and that silence, it becomes your test because she's no longer arguing to be right. She's simply letting the energy speak for itself. The woman who once gave you her words, her care, her vulnerability, now gives you nothing, not because she wants to hurt you, but because she's learned that silence is more dignified than begging for crumbs of attention. And this silence, it starts to haunt, not because she vanished loudly, but because she left quietly, without warning, and never looked back. Contrary to popular belief, men don't become obsessed with women who chase them, please them endlessly, or mold themselves to fit their needs. Obsession is not born from availability, it's born from contrast. A woman who gives too much, too soon, without requiring emotional effort in return, may be appreciated at first. But over time, she becomes predictable. Easy, safe, and not in the kind of way that creates lasting passion, but in the way that makes her presence expected, her love taken for granted, her energy overlooked. On the other hand, a woman who holds herself to a higher standard, who knows when to give and when to pull back, when to nurture and when to hold her silence, becomes an emotional challenge, not because she's playing games, but because she refuses to abandon herself to keep someone else comfortable. She triggers something deeper, not lust, not convenience, but a psychological intrigue, a desire to be chosen by someone who doesn't need you to survive. When she stops over-explaining, stops chasing, stops proving her love, the energy shifts. She no longer vibrates in the frequency of desperation. She starts to vibrate in the frequency of self-respect, And this is what men notice, even if they can't explain it. They begin to feel the difference between a woman who needs love and a woman who is love but won't give it to just anyone. That's when the obsession begins. It's not her beauty alone. It's not her kindness or sweetness. It's the fact that she can walk into a room and not need to be noticed. She doesn't seek validation. She carries it. She becomes emotionally elusive, not because she's cold, but because she only opens up to those who have earned her trust. And the more a man feels like he's being asked to rise, to meet her at her level, the more he wants to climb that mountain. Because deep down he knows any woman can make you feel wanted, but only a rare woman, a self-possessed woman, can make you feel challenged in a way that awakens your masculinity and your purpose. She doesn't hand over her love freely anymore. She chooses with intention, and that intentional love becomes irresistible. There comes a moment in every woman's life when she gets tired, not physically, but spiritually, tired of explaining herself, tired of fixing what she didn't break, tired of lowering her frequency to be understood by someone who refuses to grow. And in that sacred moment of exhaustion, something inside her clicks. She no longer wants to be accessible to energy that isn't evolving. She doesn't hate him. She doesn't want revenge. She simply becomes unreachable, not because she vanished, but because she outgrew the version of him that kept taking without giving. You see, immature energy doesn't recognize depth. It gets bored with consistency. It sees emotional availability as weakness. It feeds on attention, validation, and the illusion of control. But a woman who has learned to sit with herself, who has faced her loneliness, embraced her healing, and realigned with her own divinity, cannot be reached by that kind of energy anymore. She's not operating on the same frequency. The games that used to pull her in now feel childish. The words that once manipulated her now sound hollow. The gestures that once excited her now feel performative. It's not that she became cold. It's that she finally realized warmth given to the wrong person only burns her in the end. And so she builds something quiet and powerful inside herself, emotional boundaries. She starts to see things clearly. She sees the emotional immaturity for what it is, a distraction from her path, not a reflection of her worth. She stops pouring her light into people who live in darkness and refuse to seek their own flame, and the more she reconnects with her inner peace, the less she can tolerate the noise of confusion. She no longer responds to mixed signals, half efforts, or conditional love. She becomes a woman who can sit in silence without anxiety, who can walk away without the need for closure, who no longer needs to be chosen, because she already chose herself, and from that place, she becomes invisible to the chaos she once danced with. Not physically, not emotionally, but energetically, her soul has ascended beyond the pull of immaturity. He may still call, he may still chase, he may even start to panic as he feels her slipping away. But what he doesn't understand is this: he's not being ignored, he's being left behind. At some stage, a woman awakens to a truth she can no longer ignore. Overgiving is not love, it is self-abandonment disguised as loyalty. For too long she poured her time, her care, her energy. Even when the cup on the other side stayed empty, she tried harder, spoke softer, gave more of herself, not because she didn't value herself, but because she was taught that love means sacrifice. That being chosen means being endlessly available, but what the world doesn't always teach women is this: the more you overgive, the more you lose yourself, and no matter how much you love someone, you cannot bleed your soul dry and call it connection. At first it feels noble, putting his needs before yours, fixing the broken pieces, being the emotional anchor. But over time it becomes exhausting, because giving without reciprocity isn't love, it's emotional depletion. Eventually, she realizes that the more she gives to someone who isn't giving back, the more invisible she becomes. not because she's not enough, but because she's giving too much to someone who hasn't earned it. And that's when the shift begins. She stops showing up for people who disappear when she needs them. She stops explaining her feelings to someone who's already made up their mind. She stops rescuing a man who doesn't even recognize he's drowning. Not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. She learns to hold her love like a sacred fire, beautiful, warm, powerful, but not free for all. Because when love is poured into the wrong vessel, it turns into resentment. And when a woman reaches the point where her giving becomes a wound, not a gift, she has no choice but to close the gates. That's the turning point, when she reclaims her energy, when she finally says, no more, not in anger, but in quiet conviction. She begins to give more to herself than to anyone else. She realizes that the right man will not require her to overextend, overcompensate, or overexplain. He will meet her where she stands, not where she collapses. And in this shift she becomes more powerful than ever before, not because she stopped loving, but because she started loving herself first. There's a quiet kind of strength that doesn't need to shout, a calm that doesn't come from ignorance, but from emotional discipline. This is the power of a woman who has learned to feel everything, but not be ruled by any of it. Most people confuse emotion with weakness. They think that to be sensitive is to be fragile, but there is nothing more powerful than a woman who can sit with her own storms and still choose peace over reaction, because before she might have snapped. She might have begged, pleaded, sent long texts trying to explain her heart. She may have cried in front of someone who stood there blankly, unable or unwilling to understand the depth of her pain. But emotional discipline changes everything. It's not that she feels less. In fact, she feels even more. But she no longer lets her emotions pull her out of alignment. She's done handing over her power every time someone triggers her. She's done teaching people how to treat her by constantly overreacting to their disrespect. Instead, she breathes, she pauses, she responds, not with desperation, but with dignity. That's when she becomes truly dangerous and deeply attractive, because now her value is not just in her love, it's in her self-control. She can sit in front of the man who hurt her and not flinch. She can hear empty apologies and smile, knowing she doesn't need to accept them. She doesn't need closure from chaos anymore. She provides it for herself. And that kind of emotional mastery, it's magnetic. It's the energy that says, I am not here to fight for your respect. I am the standard. Either rise to meet it or fall away quietly. Men may desire beauty. They may chase charm, passion, and excitement. But the woman they obsess over is the one who remains calm while others compete, who speaks less but means more, who no longer wastes her energy proving anything. She doesn't need attention. She commands it simply by existing in her own alignment. This is emotional discipline, the quiet refusal to be shaken, the elegant strength of someone who has cried in silence, rebuilt herself in darkness, and now walks in the world with unshakable presence. Some women don't just enter a man's life to love him, they enter to transform him. And that transformation doesn't always come through comfort. It comes through contrast. Through her presence, he begins to feel the gap between who he is and who he's capable of becoming. You see, a conscious, self-aware woman doesn't just reflect affection. She reflects accountability. She mirrors back his weaknesses, his lack of consistency, his emotional unavailability. Not by scolding, not by shaming, but simply by being, because her energy is clear, her standards are unwavering, and her love is not unconditional in the way people misunderstand it. She may love deeply, but she will not lower herself to keep someone close. When a woman has done the inner work, when she has healed her wounds, nurtured her peace, and walked through fire alone, she carries a vibration that shakes the unprepared. She becomes a mirror that doesn't flatter. It reveals, and that mirror is uncomfortable. He starts to realize that to stay in her life, he can't remain who he was. He has to evolve, not because she demands it with words, but because her presence silently requires it. She reflects to him that his charm is not enough, that love without effort, connection without depth, and promises without action will not hold her. And the truth is, he may try to avoid that reflection. He may pull away, become defensive, even try to make her feel like she's too much, too intense, too demanding. But deep inside, he knows she's not too much, he's just not enough yet. She becomes a test not of his masculinity, but of his emotional maturity. Can he sit with himself? Can he regulate his impulses? Can he meet her honesty without becoming defensive? Can he rise not just to keep her, but to become the kind of man who's worthy of the love she carries? Because this woman doesn't beg, she doesn't chase, she doesn't compete. She simply embodies, and in doing so, she reflects not who he is today, but who he must become tomorrow, if he ever wants to stand beside her again. There is a pivotal moment in a woman's life when she realizes that peace is more precious than presence, that no matter how much she loves someone, if that love comes wrapped in chaos, confusion, and emotional instability, it's not worth the cost of her inner calm. In the past, she might have tolerated noise, textbook inconsistency, half-hearted efforts, loud apologies followed by repeated behavior, the highs and the lows that felt like passion, but were really just dysfunction dressed up as connection. Why did she stay? Because she thought that choosing love meant choosing struggle, because she believed that her role was to fix, to hold space, to prove she was strong enough to endure. But now, she's no longer interested in suffering as proof of her devotion. She's learned to enjoy her own company, to sit in silence without anxiety, to wake up without tension, to walk alone without fear. Solitude no longer feels like loneliness, it feels like freedom. And that freedom becomes her filter. If you disrupt her peace more than you contribute to it, she no longer sees that as a challenge to work through, she sees it as a boundary to enforce. Because once a woman has tasted emotional stillness after years of being shaken, she will never again choose chaos out of habit. She won't answer calls at midnight just to argue. She won't tolerate hot and cold behavior just to feel something. She won't sacrifice her clarity for connection. She understands now, being alone and at peace is 1,000 times better than being entangled and anxious. This shift isn't about pride or ego. It's about protection. It's about recognizing that her energy is sacred, that her nervous system is not a playground for someone's unhealed trauma. She becomes incredibly selective, not because she's arrogant, but because she's finally healed the part of her that used to call inconsistency love. She no longer romanticizes being chosen by someone who isn't emotionally available. She now chooses herself every single time, and in doing so, she becomes the kind of woman who can't be swayed by sweet words, temporary effort, or temporary passion. Only a man who brings clarity, calm, and consistency will be allowed into her space, because she knows love isn't proven by how much chaos you can survive, it's proven by how much peace you're willing to protect. There is a unique kind of power that doesn't come from how loudly a woman loves, or how much she gives, or how present she is in someone's life. It comes from what happens when she's no longer there. Because when a woman with depth, loyalty, and emotional intelligence finally walks away, truly walks away, her absence creates a silence that echoes louder than her words ever did. At first, her presence may have been taken for granted. She was always there, answering messages quickly, listening deeply even when no one asked how she felt, forgiving again and again even when apologies were missing, trying to keep the connection alive, sometimes even single-handedly. But presence without appreciation becomes invisible, so she stops, not out of revenge, not to teach a lesson, but because something within her breaks, and from that breaking, a boundary is born, and when she leaves, physically, emotionally, energetically, that's when her value becomes clear. Suddenly, her silence is noticed. The phone doesn't ring with her name anymore. The late-night conversations disappear. The calm, stabilizing energy she once brought is missing. Her absence disrupts everything. Because you can replace a body, but not a presence, not the way she saw through your silence, not the way she stayed when she had every reason to walk away, not the way she made broken things feel whole, without asking for anything in return but respect. When she is no longer around to carry the emotional load, when her laughter is no longer part of the background noise, when her advice, her encouragement, her softness is gone, that's when the realization hits. She wasn't just another person. She was a foundation, and you didn't lose her because she changed. You lost her because she had to protect herself from being drained by someone who didn't know how to receive her love. Her absence forces reflection. It confronts the very imbalance that was ignored while she was still present. It makes you feel the void she once filled so effortlessly, and suddenly what felt ordinary becomes irreplaceable. Not because she begged to be seen, but because her leaving was the loudest truth you refused to hear while she stayed. So understand this: a woman doesn't become powerful by raising her voice. She becomes powerful the moment she remembers who she is. Not when she gets even, but when she gets clear. Not when she fights for attention, but when she withdraws her energy with quiet dignity. Not when she tries to be everything for someone, but when she chooses to be everything for herself. The obsession doesn't begin with her presence. It begins with her absence, with the moment he realizes that her love was never guaranteed, that it was a privilege, not a possession, because when a woman finally stops begging, proving, fixing, overgiving, when she walks away without anger, without noise, without explanation, she doesn't leave empty-handed. She leaves with her power, and in that moment she becomes the one thing he can't stop thinking about, not because she wants him to, but because now he knows he'll never find her in another. He'll never forget the woman who once made him feel seen, and later made him feel the weight of her silence, and that is the moment she wins.